Para introduzir aqueles que participarão deste painel, eu quero convidar ao palco o diretor de formação do IEE, Fábio Osterman, por favor.
Boa tarde. Brasil, país do futuro. Esse foi o título dado pelo escritor austríaco Stefan Zweig ao livro no qual ele louvava as glórias do país que ele havia acolhido na década de 40. Né? E que esse título acabou se tornando uma espécie de epíteto à nossa pátria, sintetizando a crença universal no potencial desse imenso país. E também uma espécie de maldição, trazendo consigo todo o peso das oportunidades de desenvolvimento não aproveitadas desde então. A ascensão atual do Brasil ao posto de potência econômica mundial dá-se um cenário curioso, entretanto. As perspectivas são pessimistas em relação a países que sempre representaram a vanguarda do desenvolvimento político, econômico e social. Já do lado dos países marcados por uma história de equívocos e insucessos, dentre os quais o Brasil, infelizmente, ocupa lugar de destaque, impera a esperança e a confiança inabaláveis em um futuro melhor. É inegável que hoje o Brasil tem muito a ensinar ao mundo, mas não podemos, entretanto, permitir que a arrogância populista de alguns de nossos líderes impeça que aprendamos com os erros e acertos de outras sociedades em sua busca por liberdade, paz e prosperidade. Aspirações humanas universais, independente de circunstâncias étnicas ou geográficas. A atual crise e outros exemplos de superação e resiliência econômica demonstram que o caminho para o desenvolvimento econômico passa necessariamente por mais trabalho, poupança, investimento e, é claro, liberdade. Para que possamos nos livrar, de uma vez por todas, do estigma do gigante eternamente adormecido, do país com um grande potencial não aproveitado, e para que deixemos de ser finalmente o país do futuro e nos tornemos o país do presente, é absolutamente necessário que compreendamos nossa posição no mundo, para que possamos fazer do Brasil o país que queremos, começando hoje. Então, lições do mundo para o Brasil, eis o tema do presente painel. Com isso, eu gostaria de chamar a presença do nosso debatedor Helio Beltrão e dos painelistas Alberto Mingardi e Alvaro Vargas Llosa. Bom painel.
I was born in a welfare state, ruled by bureaucracy, controlled by civil servants and people dressed in grey. Got no privacy.
Senhoras e senhores, muito boa tarde. Para abrir a programação dessa tarde no Fórum da Liberdade, iniciaremos com o painel Lições do Mundo para o Brasil. Essa atividade tem a previsão de 90 minutos de duração. Cada painelista falará por 20 minutos e, ao final, teremos o debate com a plateia. Nosso primeiro convidado é o senhor Alvaro Vargas Llosa, que é escritor, jornalista, investidor individual, vive em Washington, tem nacionalidade peruana e espanhola, é acadêmico associado do Instituto Independente e colunista semanal do grupo de escritores do Washington Post e do jornal Mundo, da Espanha. É representante em Washington do grupo de mídia Copesa do Chile e autor de vários livros sobre economia política, traduzido em diversas línguas. Também foi nomeado pelo World Economic Forum como Young Economic Leader, líder econômico jovem, já faz algum tempo, né, Alvaro? E, portanto, eu passo a palavra já ao Álvaro para a participação inicial de 20 minutos.
Muito obrigado. Muchísimas gracias. Como mi portuñol es altamente ofensivo, voy a hablar en español. Y hay una segunda razón por la que creo que es muy importante que yo hable en español. Y es que me toca un rol un poco antipático, el rol del extranjero que viene a Brasil a darles lecciones a los brasileros, que me toca hablar de las cosas que no andan tan bien. Tengo la esperanza de que no entiendan una palabra de lo que voy a decir, de modo que me libre de una deportación. Intentaré hablar despacio para que la tortura sea menos cruel. Es obvio que Brasil ha sufrido una transformación impresionante en los últimos años. Cualquier persona remotamente familiarizada con este hermoso y grande país y complejo país lo puede advertir. Sin embargo, y voy a empezar por la conclusión, creo que sería un gran error pensar que la tarea está ya culminada. Creo que Brasil tiene o enfrenta un gran riesgo, que es el de confundir el estatus, que es el reconocimiento y la proyección de su poder como nación en el concierto de naciones del mundo, con la condición socioeconómica de sus habitantes, de sus familias, de sus individuos. Creo que hay una cierta impaciencia en Brasil, la impaciencia de querer que su Estado sea visto como una potencia antes de que sus ciudadanos lo sean también. Si uno observa lo que ha pasado en Brasil desde el año 85, en toda la etapa democrática de este país, verá que las prioridades han ido cambiando de una manera relativamente frecuente. Y esto creo que explica la confusión a la que me refiero. Del año 85 al año 94, prácticamente todo el énfasis estuvo en la democracia. Era un énfasis comprensible. Brasil venía de una dictadura, había que reconstruir o, en cierta forma, construir por primera vez unas instituciones democráticas dignas de ese nombre. Pero esto se trunca en el año 94 y Brasil decide conformarse con el tipo de sistema democrático que tiene. Y entonces las prioridades pasan a ser económicas, también muy comprensibles. El modelo económico del Brasil era un modelo que se estaba quedando atrás en comparación con otros, no solo del mundo, sino específicamente del vecindario de América Latina. Por tanto, a partir del año 94 y hasta el año 2001, el énfasis es prácticamente de forma excluyente un énfasis en la reforma económica. Y a partir del año 2001 vuelve a cambiar la gran prioridad de las políticas del Estado. Se considera que la reforma económica ha culminado, del mismo modo que se pensaba el año 94 que la reforma democrática ya había culminado, y entonces el énfasis pasó a ser el del asistencialismo, el de los programas sociales. Toda la imaginación, toda la energía y, por supuesto, los recursos del gran Estado brasileño pasaron a ser canalizados en función de ese objetivo y se truncó la reforma económica. De modo que tenemos en el periodo de 3 décadas unas prioridades itinerantes y cambiantes que consisten en la interrupción paulatina de objetivos que no se habían alcanzado, pero que la sociedad, o por lo menos un sector importante de la sociedad y desde luego la clase dirigente, pensó que ya se habían cumplido. ¿Qué ha producido todo esto? Bueno, ha producido una transformación parcial. Hay que empezar por reconocer esto. Desde el punto de vista económico es evidente. La economía brasileña es hoy la 6ª del mundo. Probablemente en el año 2030 sea la 4ª del mundo. Si uno revisa lo que son las 500 primeras empresas de América Latina, 225, casi la mitad, son brasileñas. Las ventas combinadas de esas empresas superan el trillón de dólares, de modo que son por lo menos 6 o 7 veces el tamaño de la economía de mi país, del Perú. Las 30 empresas multinacionales de origen brasileño tienen hoy día más de 200.000 empleados por el mundo y activos en el extranjero de casi 100.000 millones de dólares, de modo que una presencia tremendamente importante. Brasil atrae capitales de un modo significativo. El año pasado, casi 70.000 millones de dólares, entiendo que 65.000 o 66.000 millones de dólares. Al mismo tiempo, la proyección de los capitales brasileños en el extranjero es notable. Nombres como los de Vale, JBS, Odebrecht, Ipiranga, Itaú, todos estos nombres han pasado a ser parte de la reserva corporativa del mundo. Son fácilmente reconocibles. Hay hoy día una presencia brasileña desde el punto de vista comercial muy diversificada, a tal punto que, como saben ustedes mejor que yo, China es hoy el primer socio comercial del país. Al mismo tiempo que esta proyección económica, hay una proyección política muy importante. Brasil juega hoy un rol en el G20, en el club de países más poderosos del mundo. Brasil es hoy un donante del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Parte de la ayuda que el Fondo Monetario está repartiendo en el viejo continente probablemente tiene su origen en Brasil. Vaya ironía histórica. Brasil es hoy uno de los principales países en cuanto a cooperación internacional. De modo que proyección económica internacional, proyección política internacional. Pero además, en el mercado interno están pasando cosas importantes. El crecimiento de la clase media, más de 40 millones de personas se han incorporado a la clase media en los últimos años, en la última década en este país. Si uno mira la región más tradicionalmente atrasada del Brasil, el norte, el nordeste, hay cosas impresionantes. Me cuentan que más de 40 grandes centros comerciales en desarrollo, de manera que hay una expansión importante y todavía mucho campo por delante. El líder, la superficie de ventas del líder de ventas de alimentos del país, la compañía Pan de Azúcar, todavía representa más o menos la mitad de las ventas de Walmart en México, siendo México un país con la mitad de la población que el Brasil. De modo que no solamente la expansión es enorme, sino que el campo para seguir expandiéndose es enorme. De manera que hay un dinamismo interno y un dinamismo externo. Sin embargo, esto no es suficiente. Hoy día, gracias a la privatización parcial, la liberalización parcial, la globalización parcial de Brasil, esto ha sido posible. Pero sería un gran error creer que esto es suficiente. Hay una importante cantidad de problemas que subsisten en el sistema brasileño que solo podrán ser superados mediante una muy audaz reforma del sistema institucional. No hay tiempo para que haga todo el recorrido, pero quiero mencionar algunos de los problemas rápidamente y dar quizá 1 o 2 ejemplos para tratar de ilustrar esta idea general. Hay un problema que me atrevo a calificar de descomunal de gasto público, que en el fondo es un síntoma de una causa que no es otra que el tamaño del Estado brasileño. En los años 90, el Estado brasileño absorbía más o menos la 1/4 parte de la riqueza de este país. Hoy día, como hemos escuchado ayer, absorbe más o menos el 40%, que es una proporción enorme para un país que todavía no alcanzó el desarrollo. Si ustedes comparan las cifras de consumo en Brasil y las cifras de crecimiento económico, verán algo muy fascinante. El consumo aumenta a la par que el crecimiento económico. las curvas, si tuviéramos un gráfico aquí y tuviéramos que proyectar las curvas de crecimiento del Producto Bruto Interno y la de crecimiento del consumo, veríamos una relación prácticamente plana, paralela. Si ustedes comparan eso con lo que pasó y sigue pasando en China e India, que tienen otros problemas, pero que en esto quizá tienen una lección importante que enseñar al mundo, verán una situación muy distinta, y es unas curvas divergentes. Crece mucho la economía, crece un poco menos el consumo. ¿Qué significa esto? Esencialmente que hay una tasa de ahorro más grande, que crece a medida que crece la economía, o por lo menos que crecía a medida que crecía la economía. Y por tanto, un ahorro que estaba en condiciones de financiar gran parte de las inversiones, a diferencia de lo que pasaba en el primer mundo, donde esas inversiones, además ese consumo, se financiaban esencialmente mediante la deuda. ¿Por qué ocurre esto en Brasil? Yo creo que en gran parte, no solamente por la cultura consumista de una sociedad que súbitamente se vio con posibilidades de consumir, seguramente esa es una parte de la historia, sino también por lo que es el tamaño del Estado, el tamaño del gobierno. Durante muchos años, de una forma casi crónica, el Estado brasileño ha producido un déficit de entre 3 y 4% del Producto Bruto Interno. De manera que gran parte del aumento del consumo que se registraba en esa relación entre consumo y economía muy probablemente provenía del Estado. El Estado estaba constantemente impulsando grandes causas gastadoras. Por ejemplo, decidió que Bandes, el Banco de Desarrollo, tenía que ser una de las grandes palancas del desarrollo. Si Bandes necesitaba 45.000 millones de dólares para canalizar hacia los objetivos del desarrollo, los tenía. Se decidía que era necesario un tren bala entre São Paulo y Río, 20.000 millones de dólares, aquí están. Se decidía que Petrobras necesitaba 225.000 millones de dólares para duplicar el número de barriles diarios que era capaz de producir, de petróleo, por supuesto. Y entonces se buscaba la forma de ayudar a Petrobras a conseguir ese objetivo. De modo que el gasto descomunal del gobierno brasileño ha sido un factor muy importante en esta relación. Por otro lado, había y sigue habiendo un gasto estructural que es muy difícil reformar, como lo está viendo la presidenta en estos días, que tiene que ver, por ejemplo, con las pensiones. Es uno de los pocos sistemas de previsión que no ha sido privatizado en América Latina, el de Brasil. Hoy día representa más o menos un déficit del 10% del Producto Bruto y tiene una especial incidencia en la vida política del país, porque esa traba, ese bloqueo, ese obstáculo que hay a cualquier tipo de reforma, probablemente es también un factor por el cual no se reforman otros aspectos del Estado brasileño. De modo que hay un gasto que es descomunal. Hay además un problema que tiene que ver y que podríamos llamar dirigismo, que es esta expresión que inventaron los franceses para hablar de un Estado que, sin ser necesariamente el dueño de los factores de producción, es el gran demiurgo que se mueve detrás de ellos para orientarlos en una determinada dirección. Bertrand de Jouvenel, que es un filósofo francés muy famoso, hablaba de teleocracias, en las que el Estado le fijaba a la sociedad unos objetivos y luego movilizaba todo en función de los objetivos para dictarle a la sociedad una trayectoria. Más o menos eso es lo que está pasando con la economía brasileña. Hay un dirigismo del Estado que se manifiesta de muy distintas maneras. Por ejemplo, si una empresa importante del Brasil no se pliega a los planes de la política industrial, es muy probable que el gobierno mueva sus fichas para despedir, para sacar de la jefatura de esa empresa al responsable, Hay un caso bastante conocido, no mencionaré nombres, pero de una empresa minera muy importante del Brasil, que no aceptó en los últimos años la política industrial, porque no por razones antipatrióticas, sino porque era contraria a los intereses de la empresa, que lógicamente quería defender. Por tanto, hubo algunos despidos, se retrasaron algunas inversiones previstas, se mandó fabricar buques cargueros en China en lugar de encargárselos a astilleros brasileños, y por supuesto el resultado fue que los políticos empezaron a meter la mano en las decisiones de la empresa y finalmente esa persona tuvo que salir de esa empresa. Esa es una de las muchas formas que toma el dirigismo económico en la sociedad brasileña. Hay también un problema de proteccionismo. Entiendo que en el panel anterior yo no pude estar presente porque tenía un compromiso, se habló del proteccionismo, de modo que no voy a dar muchos detalles, pero hay que insistir en esto una y otra vez. Hay una tendencia en Brasil, cada vez que se percibe un déficit en la relación comercial bilateral con alguna potencia o ni siquiera potencia, a tener una reacción instintivamente proteccionista. Lo hemos visto con México en los últimos tiempos. Hay un acuerdo comercial con México, como saben ustedes, que permite la importación de autos. El año 2011, por razones que no voy a explicar, ustedes las conocen mucho mejor que yo, se disparó la venta de autos mexicanos en el mercado brasileño. La reacción inmediata de Brasil fue poner trabas, poner obstáculos. No fueron suficientes, siguió entrando una enorme cantidad de vehículos de México. Y entonces la reacción de Brasil fue una escalada del conflicto comercial y amenazar con cancelar el acuerdo comercial con México. Ese es un ejemplo de muchos. Si uno abre la prensa brasileña de los últimos 3 y 4 años, son innumerables los artículos que se quejan, por ejemplo, del ingreso de productos chinos y constantes referencias al famoso dumping chino, es decir, a la utilización de subsidios en China para colocar los productos por debajo de lo que debería ser su precio. De modo que en general hay una tendencia proteccionista en el sistema. Hay una ley para que las agencias y entidades del Estado solo compren productos brasileños. Esa es otra forma de proteccionismo en el sistema brasileño que traba la competencia privada. La ley, por ejemplo, laboral o la legislación laboral es otro aspecto que a mi modo de ver es sumamente anticuado en Brasil. Entiendo, me di el trabajo de tratar de hacer un listado de todas las normas que afectan el mercado laboral en Brasil. Hay más de 900. No creo que haya un solo burócrata en el mundo capaz de recordar 900 normas, y mucho menos si están repartidas en todo el cuerpo legal, desde la Constitución hasta la legislación más pequeña. Es imposible que un mercado laboral funcione con flexibilidad y de una forma mínimamente eficiente si hay 900 normas, probablemente muchas de ellas contradictorias entre sí, gravitando sobre ese mercado. También me di el trabajo de buscar la lista de los impuestos que se cobran en Brasil. Yo he tenido muchas experiencias con empresarios brasileños que se han quejado mucho de la cantidad de impuestos que se pagan en Brasil. La última vez que yo había tenido esta conversación con un empresario brasileño, me dijo que había enumerado hasta 61 impuestos diferentes. Bueno, ojalá hubiera 61 impuestos diferentes en Brasil, ya son más de 86. Hay varios portales incluso que hoy dedican buena parte de su energía a hacer ese catastro infernal de la cantidad de impuestos que se cobran en el mundo, y particularmente en países como Brasil, y ya superan los 86. De modo que hay una serie de elementos que son sintomáticos de un gobierno y de un Estado que está no solamente consumiendo una parte muy importante de la riqueza brasileña, sino que está trabando el funcionamiento de los mercados, que está sofocando la posibilidad de que más y más brasileños se incorporen a la gran aventura del capitalismo moderno y vayan emancipándose de esa dependencia que los programas sociales han ido creando entre un sector de la población de menores ingresos y el Estado brasileño. Mencionaré, porque ya creo que me falta muy poco tiempo, 2 o 3 cosas que creo que son muy importantes de tener presentes, de tener en cuenta. Una de ellas tiene que ver con la innovación tecnológica. Un país que aspira a ser potencia como Brasil tendría que tener una mucho mayor participación de la que tiene en el mundo de la invención, en el mundo de la innovación tecnológica. La investigación y el desarrollo en Brasil pasan por una etapa extraordinariamente subdesarrollada y precaria. A pesar de que hay muchos científicos brasileños muy reconocidos en el mundo, y además entiendo que en las publicaciones científicas de todo el planeta la presencia de científicos brasileños es muy importante. Leí el otro día una cifra interesante, casi el 3% de los artículos científicos que se publican en el mundo tienen autores brasileños, lo cual es una proporción, aunque suene pequeña, en realidad muy importante. Sin embargo, hoy en día la investigación y el desarrollo, como digo, son muy precarios en Brasil. El 70% de esa inversión la hace el gobierno y no las empresas privadas que deberían estar haciéndolas. Y el mundo académico, los centros de investigación que tendrían que estar a la vanguardia de esta innovación, no representan más del 10% de la inversión que hace Brasil en este rubro. Hay un retraso muy importante que probablemente tiene que ver en parte con las condiciones que creó el Estado gastador, el Estado intervencionista y el Estado dirigista del Brasil. Yo creo que esa es un área donde Brasil tiene que hacer un gran esfuerzo para que la iniciativa privada recupere espacios con respecto al Estado, porque de lo contrario la capacidad de renovación y de innovación de la economía brasileña se va a ver muy limitada. Y finalmente, esto también se mencionó esta mañana y ayer, de modo que lo diré muy al pasar, el tema de la infraestructura es muy importante en Brasil. Hay un retraso desde el punto de vista de la infraestructura. Basta llegar al aeropuerto de São Paulo y compararlo con los aeropuertos del Asia o incluso con el aeropuerto de Montevideo, que es un aeropuerto fantástico, más pequeño en términos relativos, pero basta compararlo para darse cuenta que esos no son el tipo de estructuras que tendría que tener un país como Brasil, que tiene hoy día ese gran estatus internacional. Hay una presencia excesiva, creo yo, del Estado en la infraestructura, una presencia insuficiente de la economía privada y el resultado se está reflejando en lo que es a todas luces una infraestructura deficiente. Dicho todo esto, este es un gran país, yo no tengo la menor duda de eso, es un país que tiene ventajas extraordinarias sobre sus grandes competidores del BRIC, por ejemplo. Es un país mucho más libre desde el punto de vista político que China. Es un país socialmente mucho más integrado que India. Y yo, viniendo del Perú, aprecio especialmente eso. Son muchos los países latinoamericanos con grandes dificultades de integración social. Este es un país infinitamente más integrado, aunque seguramente hay cosas que mejorar allí también, que India. De modo que yo no tengo ninguna duda de que Brasil está en perfectas condiciones de dar el salto al desarrollo. Pero creo que cometería un gran error, y esto lo digo con inmenso cariño y amor y admiración hacia Brasil, cometería un gran error el Brasil de confundir su gran estatus internacional hoy día con la condición socioeconómica de sus ciudadanos. Brasil es un país que está a mitad de camino y llegar al primer mundo no es otra cosa que un acto de voluntad. Dependerá de los brasileños y solo de los brasileños, y por supuesto las brasileñas, que en los próximos 25 años Brasil sea un país de primer mundo y que la próxima vez que nos reunamos para hablar de 25 años no sea para decir dónde estará Brasil dentro de un cuarto de siglo, sino para decir qué cosas maravillosas Brasil le puede enseñar al mundo, de cómo pasar del tercer o segundo mundo al primer mundo en un lapso relativamente pequeño de tiempo. Muchas gracias.
É isso mesmo, Álvaro. De que adianta o Brasil, o governo está bem se o povo está mal, né? E eu tive recentemente em Mianmar e o aeroporto de Yangon é bem melhor que o de Guarulhos, então não é só por aqui, não. Agradecemos a participação inicial do senhor Alvaro Vargas Llosa. Imediatamente ouviremos o senhor Alberto Mingardi, que é diretor-geral do Instituto Bruno Leoni, doutor em Ciências Políticas pela Universidade de Pavia, Itália, já ocupou diferentes cargos em vários grupos de reflexão, incluindo o Centro para a Nova Europa em Bruxelas, do qual foi membro sênior, e é professor adjunto do Cato Institute. Com a palavra, o senhor Alberto Mingardi.
Bom dia. But unfortunately, that's the only Portuguese I know. So I am ashamed of myself because we're between Latins, and in between Latins it's terrible to speak English, but I will need to speak in English for the next 20 minutes. I should really thank you for this invitation. I'm honored of being here. I'm very happy of being in a panel with one of my heroes, Alvaro Vargas Llosa, but particularly I can barely express my admiration for all of you. I mean, I cannot tell you how uplifting it is to see so many young people committed to the cause of freedom and of good and ready to help Brazil to solve its own problem. So thank you very much for allowing me to have this wonderful experience. But after listening to Alvaro, I better understood what's my role over here today. My role here today is to cheer you up. Because, of course, you're committed to solve the many problems of Brazil, but believe me, no matter how big the problem of Brazil looks to you today, they're much smaller than the problem of Europe today. And for countries, it's very much like for individuals. I mean, it's always beautiful, makes you happy to become rich when you were poor, and it's very painful to become poor when you were rich. And that's unfortunately what's happening in my country. Speaking seriously on the lessons I think you can derive from what is happening in Europe nowadays, I think there are a few lessons that may be very helpful for those like you that are shaping the Brazil of the future. One lesson is about the negative consequences of creating a too big entitlement state, of putting too much money in the pocket of government, and at a certain point, eventually, creating gigantic public debts. Another very interesting lesson is about the fact that if you want good policy internally in a state, you need to go for good policies. You need to try to develop good policies on your own. You cannot just hope you're externalizing, policy making via international treaties, and therefore you're receiving back good classical liberal policies. And that's part of the problem we had with the making of the EU. And the third lesson is about the quality and the importance for the elite in a country to be clear thinking. Because the biggest problem we have in Europe nowadays are basically the problem solvers. I mean, you are trying to solve the problem of Brazil. Merkel, Sarkozy, Mario Monti, these are the people trying to solve the problem of Europe, and this is why Europe is doomed. In order to get into this discussion, I asked for some help to the ghost of an old economist, Wilhelm Röpke. Röpke was a German economist. He longed for freedom so much that he died as a Swiss citizen. And Röpke was one of the main influence upon Konrad Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, so the great manufacturer of what was called the social market economy that brought to the German economic miracle. Interestingly enough, in 1958, Röpke wrote a very interesting article on European integration. Röpke, of course, was a great admirer of the culture of Europe. He was a great advocate of free trade, but he feared that if Europe was to be manufactured by socialist government getting together, by welfare states getting together, the output could not be as good as many people were hoping. Röpke very beautifully described the essence of Europe as diversity. And that's really a key point. I mean, when we are talking about Europe, we are not talking about a nation state. We are talking about a variety of different regions, nations, communities, culture. And the big problem, of course, with centralization, the big problem with dirigism, as Alvaro already mentioned, is the fact that with dirigism you get into unanimity, into harmonization, instead of exalting diversity. What you can see over there is a very simplified timeline of the development of the European Union. As you may have seen, as you may have thought by yourself, I mean, the construction of a European common economy and even of a European common currency went rather smoothly. I mean, nation-state gave up their own national currencies for the euro in 1999. In 2002, the euro substituted for banknotes bearing a national government stamp. All in all, the development of the European Union took place over some 50 years of tremendous prosperity, of peace, but also, on the other hand, of the development of the entitlement state, of the development of the welfare state nationally. What we need to keep in mind to understand the current crisis, and particularly to understand the attitude of the European elite towards the current crisis, is the fact that the European construction was ambiguous right from the beginning. Part of the European construction was what we may call the Europe of Adam Smith. The idea was, of course, that after the Second World War we needed European states to live in peace one with the other, and commerce, economic integration, was really the means by which we could have achieved permanent peace. But on the other hand, Wilhelm Röpke was right in pointing out that the governments that were trying to unify Europe were not governments committed to free trade or to free market policies internally. I mean, they were governments that were extending state action more and more in their internal economy, governments that were delivering the mail, they were delivering any kind of services, as Tom Palmer pointed out today, and particularly were not governments that were committed to what Röpke called the reintegration of Europe, economically speaking, because Europe was already integrated basically after 1814. We had monetary stability, very low customs, very low duties, and therefore the continent had a phenomenal century of economic expansion, prosperity, and peace. All of that collapsed with the First World War, and eventually what Europe needed was reintegrating itself. But during the previous phase of European economic integration, free trade was basically the byproduct of, roughly speaking, severely limited governments in national affairs. Of course, Röpke was not always right, because this very mixed European construction had a very interesting role to play in a bunch of different areas. The European integration was instrumental for many countries to achieve privatization, for example, to put some order into their public finances. That's clearly the case of Italy, and one day actually we thought it was the case of Greece just 5 years ago. But all in all, the biggest problem we did have in this process of European integration was the fact that government thought that they could surrender some of their pretenses, some of their claims to intervene in the economy, but not all of them. It's like they decided they were vegetarians basically for 2 days a week. Now, vegetarians are not vegetarians 2 days a week. And that's exactly what happened, and that's the root of many of the problems we did have. Another of the problem we did have exactly the same fashion is that, and on that point Röpke was right, European leaders integrating member states that were greatly homogeneous in terms of internal policies, they conceived the output of this economic integration as basically a bigger nation state. Not an area in which you could see a plurality of community, regions, and nations to cooperate, but just a bigger version of the nation state. Everything evolved into its next step with the introduction of the euro. Classical liberal economists like Milton Friedman and, of course, Martin Feldstein criticized the euro right from the beginning because the euro was a constructivist dream. It was artificial money. However, if you look at the euro for the first 10 years of its life, the euro was highly successful, and in particular, the euro relieved some of the economies of the European Union from badly and capriciously conceived monetary policies run by national government and deeply influenced by national fiscal authorities. So up to a point, the euro really worked as a monetary union, as a way of externalizing the power of conditioning the money supply. However, the euro was born with three inescapable problems. The first one, there were never clear rules for exiting the euros, and there were never clear rules for punishing those that were behaving in a way that was inconsistent with the treaties regulating the economic life of member states. Second, labor markets in the European Union were not, and they are still not, integrated. And that's the main consequence of the existence of the welfare state. I mean, in between 1814 and 1914, the European economy was more or less integrated because it was not that much of a big deal if an Italian worker moved to Germany or if a French worker moved to Holland, because none of them was thinking of having, you know, a bunch of guarantees, I mean, some entitlements to get back from his own government. Now the game is completely different. I mean, people cost as much as half of their cost to the firm in payroll contributions and taxes. And of course, I mean, that's the third problem. The fiscal rules that were put into the Maastricht Treaty, including the fact that the debt to GDP ratio was to go down to 80 and then 60%. Well, those rules were never really enforced. They were a facade. Everybody knew they were there, but as a very famous Italian president of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, once said, the Growth and Stability Pact was stupid, and so why you're paying attention to a stupid pact? These three problems show you that the European elite never considered the euro for what the euro was. The euro was never considered as purely a monetary union. The euro was always a means to something else, basically a Trojan horse to arrive at some point at the construction of a nation state as big as Europe itself. And all the problems we have nowadays, really, all the problems we have nowadays can be basically traced back to the fact that we didn't consider the euro for what the euro was. Here again, I have another simplified timeline for you about the history of the euro. And as you can see, everything went more or less smoothly against the crisis. The first reaction of the European member states to the financial crisis coming from the shore of the United States was to spend money. But after they started spending money, they realized, uh-oh, we have a public debt problem. And of course, the biggest and the first in line to show this public debt problem was Greece. We've been trying to solve the Greek problem ever since 2009. We basically had a meeting to solve the euro problem, to solve the Greek crisis, once every 10 days on average. They worked very well, didn't they? And the whole thing arrived to a point, I mean, the whole drama, the old tension skyrocketed to the point that in August last year, of course, the European Central Bank started buying Italian and Spanish bonds on the pretense that in this way they were calming down the bond market. That was not enough, and in December 2011, the European Central Bank started a new round of quantitative easing by providing European banks basically free money for 2 years. I mean, the famous LTRO program. Of course, by February this year, the amount that European banks borrowed out of the European Central Bank arrived to the staggering amount of 1 trillion euro. Now, just to give you an idea, if you devote yourself just in counting euros in banknotes of 500 euros each, you just do that for the rest of your life, it will take you 63.5 years, basically, to arrive at the point that you counted €1 trillion. So Tom Palmer today reminded us that there are no longer typewriters repairers around, but given the pace at which European states, the European Central Bank, and of course the US are bailing out companies and states, it's a new wonderful profession for you out there. The bailout computadores, the bailout contadores, bailout counters, just counting the money that governments are throwing away. This is a small graph that gives you an idea of the real problem with EDAF, and it gives you a sense of the way in which European deficit and European debt for the euro areas, for the 12 core euro countries went in the last 30 years, basically. As you can see, there was a moment in which, because of the introduction of the euro, public deficits were tempered and public debt was tempered as well, but that moment, didn't last long. What is the most interesting, though, is this graph. This graph that was elaborated by the ACB as well, it gives you a sense of tax and spending in different European countries. And what you can get out of this graph is basically there are no minimal state in Europe. I mean, even the state that spend and tax the least, they are basically in the neighborhood of Slovakia and Estonia. They do spend and tax more than 30% of the national income. This is what you need to keep in mind when you're considering the trouble lying behind today's European crisis. Not so much a crisis of a common currency, not so much the collapse of a monetary union, but the inevitable output of a political process that produced a machinery, the entitlement state, whose cost was so high that no political class ever could force their electors, their voters, to pay the bill in full. And therefore, they needed to have future generations to pay the bill. As you may know, all the wisdom of the human race was condemned in the saga of Star Wars, and particularly by Yoda. And Yoda famously said, "Do or do not. There is no try." Interestingly enough, the European ruling classes have been trying to save the euro for the last 2 years. And so far they did miserably for a variety of reasons. One very simple, very understandable reason is that the political cycles, unfortunately, forces them to go towards worse and worse policies. Just in the next month, we have election in Greece and in France. In 2013, you have elections in Italy and in Germany. Therefore, there's a lot of pressure from national electorate not to go too hard on the way to austerity. But more than that, the problem lies in their ideology. The European ruling class never conceived the euro only a monetary union. Likewise, the European community, the custom union, was never considered only a custom union. They were both Trojan horses for political integration, for manufacturing a bigger state having its capital in Brussels instead of Rome, Paris, or Berlin. Why that's a problem? Well, that problem lies also in the fact that European voters don't want that. I mean, anytime you go quizzing the European voters, they vote against this project. And therefore, the vision of the European ruling class was basically that you need crisis to get towards a further step of political integration. The most enduring legacy of any crisis is always its narrative. I mean, the biggest legacy of the 1929 crisis is not the institution of the New Deal, it's the fact that we were schooled for ages being told that there was a big crisis of capitalism and you need to balance some tendencies of instability that are inherent in the capitalist system. Likewise, European rulers are nowadays developing their own narratives. Their own narrative basically says that the only way in which you can overcome this kind of crisis is by having a fiscal union and a centralized decision-making system. Interestingly enough, this is a debt crisis, and nobody, really nobody, in the European ruling class, nobody among the people that may or may not be elected in France or in Greece, speak about the sources of public debt. It seems that public debt materialized out of nothing, magically, not that it was nurtured by years and years of profligate spending. History, I may predict, will be a very harsh mistress. But also, an interesting fact is that history can be capricious as well, mainly because of Germany. The solution the European leaders found so far to get out of the European crisis is a solution that, if you take that seriously, will force member states to bring about amazing reform processes. Thank you. It is this fiscal compact that basically requires member states to have a balanced budget, if not a surplus, and to bring their public debt to the reference level of 60% of GDP, reducing it at a pace of 1/20th a year. That could be a revolution. The big problem is that, of course, everybody is pledging to a pact nobody is ready to honor. I mean, the left in Italy and in France has already said that if they win elections, they will not oblige to the fiscal pact as it is now. The fiscal pact, if taken seriously, will of course force all the member states to restructure, dip down their spending. And the way in which Europeans should restructure their spending is basically cutting and cutting and cutting. Unfortunately, most member states have taken the routes of what Mario Draghi, the ECB chairman, described as the bad fiscal consolidation. It's basically increasing taxes, squeezing the pockets of taxpayers. The problem we see then in Europe is that the states are basically bankrupt. I mean, some of them in a more evident way, Greece, but some of them are going to be bankrupt pretty soon. I mean, look at France. I look at the market bonds, the bond market for France. But the European ruling classes are not going to surrender the welfare state, because the welfare state is the tool by which they manage to create and to maintain their own consensus in society. Therefore, at the end of the day, the question is, who will survive? A unified Europe, an economically integrated Europe, or the welfare state at national level? Here we are again at Röpke. A great intuition by Röpke in that 1958 essay was that the European welfare state and the European economic community were developing synchronously. But the problem is that you can have one or the other. The idea that you're building together an integrated Europe ends up in, preparing the ground for nothing but a European bloc that integrates just social policies and it manages their spending policies in the same way. This is the problem we do have, and this is why we are not going to be getting better any soon, because our ruling class is by definition in denial of the fact we need to get our welfare state deep down reformed. So basically what they're doing, they are ignoring the fact that the law of gravity exists in politics too. You cannot spend your whole life spending far too much given what's your income, and that of course of the fact that, as many, many papers showed us, high and higher ratio of public debt influence negatively also economic growth. I think the main lesson of the European crisis for Brazil are many. The most relevant one is that, of course, if they ask you to join the European Union, don't do that. But the really big ones, one is a lesson that we can trace back to a wonderful saying by Milton Friedman. It's a wonderful saying, it's very simple, and as most simple and true things, it's really banal. But as George Orwell once told us, in very difficult time, the most heroic thing you should do is just restating the obvious. And what you need to restate as an obvious but often forgotten thing is that there are no free lunches. And that applies also to welfare entitlements. And the other most important lesson is really that what the elite thinks has a huge influence in politics, because it gives, even to the voters, it shapes the glasses through which voters understand their own interest in the long run. And therefore, I think there are basically no more worthy activity in Brazil than what you're doing here these days, which is trying to equip your ruling class, trying to equip your elite with the right tools to understand reality and not just to move on from failure to failure because they need to consolidate their consensus. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos a participação inicial do senhor Alberto Mingardi nesse quarto painel. A seguir, daremos início à sessão de perguntas e respostas. Alberto, you made... I will speak in English. So I feel a little bit depressed by your presentation of what's going on in Europe. So let me give back some of that feeling to you, so you can feel depressed as well, because we also we also had in Brazil the law of gravity of politics, but it was not apples falling on the heads. It was like mostly tomatoes on the faces of the politicians back in the 90s because of the gravity of the situation, not the law of gravity of Newtonian effect. The politicians in Brazil appeared to have learned some things from the beginning of the 90s. So today we have a lot of taxes, a very big government, but at least we have some austerity in the sense that the budget is balanced. While in Europe, apart maybe from Germany and some other few countries, the government are spending money as if there's no tomorrow. And they're following the advice of some economists like Paul Krugman and the like. So has the student, Brazil, become the teacher now? What do you think of that?
Of course, I mean, if the Maastricht Treaty was taken seriously, we wouldn't be in these troubles. But you know how many countries in Europe obliged to the Maastricht Treaty for all the years ever since the treaty was signed? Over 17 and not exactly Germany and Spain, but Finland and Luxembourg. That was it. And the problem over there was that, of course, I mean, these are international treaties. I mean, we need to be in the EU. We need to externalize some of our policies. But then, of course, the national political game is a different one. I think it's very likely that Brazil will become the teacher. The problem I do have, just to get more into the depression, is that I really wonder if Europeans have seen enough brain power to be good students at this point. Because when you look at states like France, I mean, France is the quintessential example of that. I can bet something with you. Whoever wins the French election, it will be a socialist. Because there's not much difference in between Sarkozy and Hollande. It's very much the same approach. That's dirigism. Well, French people have been enjoying a beautiful quality of life for many years. They had a mixed economy with a strong emphasis on the mixed and very little understanding of how economics work. Their culture is so deep down hostile to any notion of free enterprise that they even consider, and come on, this is the country of the physiocrats, the country of Turgot, the country of Bastiat, the country of Benjamin Constant, but they even consider free enterprise per se as an alien concept. Free enterprise is Anglo-Saxon. I mean, Europe is a continent that flourished because of great entrepreneurs, because of splendid firms, because of magnificent entrepreneurial idea, because of creativity that was peerless in the world. And nonetheless, Europeans now consider entrepreneurship, business creativity, market freedom, alien, Anglo-Saxon, something that you need to swim through the channel to find in England. That's really depressing. I mean, the biggest problem we do have lies in the culture of our people. And I say that coming from a country that is still home to a phenomenal number of great entrepreneurs. Let me just finish on this. Our fiscal consolidation in Italy is so much a bad fiscal consolidation that really the program of the government can be summarized in squeezing Italian taxpayers as lemons. That's the idea. Now, you may listen to lots of things, lots of reports telling you that Italy has so much a big player in the world of the informal economy. I mean, the Italian national sport, second national sport after football is tax evasion and so on and so forth. But if you look at data, Italians are the most heavily taxed European after the Nordic country and the French. And of course, the quality of public service you get in Italy is not even close to the one of Sweden or Finland. Now, the real fiscal pressure, the overall tax burden for next year is estimated at 55% of the GDP. You got great uncertainty because nobody knows what's going to be happening and how much our taxes will be raised in a matter of 2 months. What's the great output of that? Ever since the beginning of the year, ever since January 1st, you got 25 entrepreneurs committing suicide because they couldn't go on with their own small businesses. It's not just an economic tragedy. It is really the brain power of the country killing itself.
Vamos passar para o Brasil, Álvaro. Ontem, primeiro para a Argentina.
¿Prefieres en español o en inglés? Podemos hacerlo todo en inglés.
In English? Okay.
I don't mind, whatever is...
Let's do it in English.
Okay.
Let's do it in English. Yesterday, the Argentine government has basically confiscated YPF, which is a big oil producer there. And this seems like a distant possibility for Brazil, outright confiscation. However, we have seen in the last month, for example, the dirigism that you're talking about, in which the government has ordered the state-owned banks to decrease interest rates on loans to individuals and small companies. And we are, of course, you mentioned the example of Vale do Rio Doce, in which I have to say the example you mentioned about Roger Agnelli was here yesterday, and he does not have a job anymore with Vale, which is looking increasingly like a state-owned company. And in the past, we had state-owned banks. Each state in Brazil would have their own banks, and with time, they would have bad debts, of course, because they lend to the government, and they will build what we call the skeletons. So how do you see that whole issue? Do you see that? Do you think that you know, the dirigism that we have is just confiscation in disguise?
Well, there are many different points that you made, and all of them are very important. First of all, about Argentina. What happened yesterday in Argentina, I imagine most of you know about this, is truly a tragedy. This is the kind of thing that we thought would never happen again in Latin America. It's the kind of thing that used to happen a long time ago. It was the essence of the populist model, what we call populism in Latin America, and there's a slightly different meaning in the United States. And it was all part, or supposed to be part of the distant past, that nightmare that we had supposedly left behind. What's happening in Argentina is really very easy to explain. The model has collapsed. The Peronista model, it's not Cristina Kirchner's model, it's the Peronista model. It's a model that's been basically present in Argentina for decades. Is essentially a model through which the government subsidizes society, large chunks of society, by squeezing the most productive parts of society. That will be mostly agriculture in Argentina. And they do it through different means. Eventually, the model is unviable. In other words, there is no way to fund it by squeezing the most productive sectors of the economy, at which point you begin to take over, to nationalize whatever you can. So when the first signs of a problem developed in the Argentinian model, what Kirchner did was to nationalize the pension system. I spoke before about how the Brazilian pension system is one of the few that has not been privatized in Latin America. The Argentinian system had been privatized, and that's the first thing they captured. That was, of course, after they had tried to squeeze everything out of the agricultural sector through taxes and other regulations. But that was not enough. The money in the pension system, which was a lot of money, was not enough. So they captured the reserves of the country outright. They said they wouldn't use that money for regular public expenditure. They lied. They used the money for all sorts of expenditures, and that was not enough. So now they have begun the next stage of the collapse of the model, which is the takeover of other companies, huge nationalizations, as part, of course, of a patriotic drive against evil outsiders who are sucking the blood of Argentina. So you have started now a cycle of nationalizations. I doubt very much this will be alone. And it is basically, it signifies two things. One is that, of course, that the model has collapsed. That's very clear. But it signifies something else. And that is that we, liberals, classical liberals, have a huge fight in our hands. Because it is one thing for Hugo Chavez to nationalize a company. We have all somehow decided in Latin America that Chavez is the loony left. And it's quite another for Argentina to engage in such a huge nationalization. The political implications, I think, are much larger if Argentina, which had not quite gone down the path of Chavez, even though it was a populist model, begins to do things of this nature, at least on this scale, because they have already nationalized companies in Argentina, but this is a much larger scale, and this is a huge political conflict. So I think the fight for liberty in Latin America is going to have to be intensified greatly in the next few years if we don't want Argentina to spread its example around. In terms of Brazil, you mentioned austerity a moment ago, and I want to say a couple of quick things about this, because there's always a risk when a government balances the budget to think that that's the end of the problem. And of course, as Alberto was mentioning, you have many ways of balancing a budget. And if you do it through taxation, if you do it by squeezing the productive sectors of the economy, you may be temporarily balancing a budget, but you're not setting the stage for prosperity. That's one thing that I think Brazil needs to have in mind. The way to balance a budget is to lower expenditures. That's the way to balance a budget. The second issue here is beware of governments in Latin America that claim to balance the budget. Usually the expression they use is primary balance or primary surplus. Whenever you hear that expression, you need to get hold of your wallet. Because usually it means they're leaving out the financial side, they're leaving out the paying off of the debt, as if that was not part of your expenditures. If a government needs to spend money in whatever else it wants to spend money, and it also needs to pay off debts, then why on earth would you dissociate the financial aspect of that from overall public expenditures? So beware when somebody tells you they have balanced the budget, and make sure they are not leaving out the paying off of the debt. Just as you would in a company. If I study a company's balance sheet, and there's a huge financial debt there, then whatever the income statement tells me, it's something I need to be aware of. Well, exactly the same principle applies in a government, no? And finally, I think it's also important to understand in Brazil, Brazilians, at least from the outside, that's the way we see it, tend to be traumatized by very high interest rates. It's something that Brazilians have been trying to lower for a long time, and quite rightly so. They are very high in Brazil. Well, it's really important to understand the connection between interest rates, high interest rates, and of course government public expenditure. I think interest rates are usually a symptom of a problem. They're not a cause. When you confuse the symptom with the cause, what you try to do is what you just mentioned. You tell banks to lower them. No. Interest rates are never a cause. They're usually a symptom of a problem. And the cause, the real cause of the problem is government expenditure. So I think you need to really tackle the cause of the problem, and then you will see interest rates go down, as they have in many other countries of Latin America, including Peru.
You mentioned... Alvaro, you mentioned BNDES. And I would like you both to comment on this question. BNDES mainly gets money from workers and the people and gives it to big companies through subsidized loans, usually companies that don't need the money because they have access to the capital markets. And to add insult to injury, the BNDES also has become the vehicle through which the government can bypass the Lei de Responsabilidade Fiscal, because this doesn't show on the net debt numbers, but the gross debt of Brazil is going up dramatically, and later has to be paid by the people, as you mentioned. Should BNDES continue to exist and choose winners through favoritism?
The short answer is no. BNDES is one of the tools of dirigism in Brazil. Dirigism, there's many ways to describe it. One way is the belief that economic power needs to be constructed from the top down. If that's your starting point, what's going to tend to happen is the government is going to create tools to do that. One of the tools that dirigism takes or uses in Brazil in order to achieve those goals is this bank, this development bank, that has very perverse effects throughout society. One of them is to hide real expenditures, of course. Another one is to pick winners and pick losers. I mentioned the $45 billion a moment ago. That's a huge amount of money, about a third of the entire GDP of Peru, for instance. that has been used to fund all sorts of enterprises. In recent years, the Brazilian government, through that bank, has funded everything from meat to all sorts of course, commodities. And it has even funded, I understand, or I think in that case it was not BNDES, but the Caixa Econômica Federal, which has funded international takeovers. Just think of that. I mean, the idea of using a state agency, a state entity, to help private companies take over other companies is entirely ludicrous, because if other governments begin to do the same thing, then you're going to really set the stage for war. That's going to create an environment in which the connection between economic and therefore political and therefore military tension is going to drive to war. So it's entirely ludicrous. But this has been done in Brazil. Another example is that has also to do with the Caixa Econômica Federal is the construction industry. In that case, it was even worse, because this led to bankruptcies, it led to fraud, to corruption. So these agencies, these entities that are used by the government in order to create economic power, stemming from a vision of economic power as a top-down process, I think is something that Brazilians are going to really need to think about if they're going to tackle dirigism. But of course, it's very hard to reverse that situation once it's there, because there are a lot of vested interest in that state of things.
Alberto?
Well, two of the most dangerous words in the vocabulary are industrial policy. You know, the problem with that is that it really doesn't work. I mean, when did the state pick up the right winner? Never. I mean, look at Google. It didn't start because of a government program. The Silicon Valley didn't develop because a government commission was formed and people decided that was the right place to invest in that kind of industry. But of course, I mean, it needs a great moral fiber from the point of view of the individual entrepreneur to resist the sirens of industrial policy. Because clearly, I mean, you are in the market. I mean, when the market is a competitive market, you're competing for customers. You're competing for people buying the goods and services you do produce. But there is also a market for political favor, for being the friend of the king. And it is actually very pleasant to be the friend of the king. I mean, politicians, some of them at least, are nice guys. It's good to be in company of ministers and go to the opera together and enjoy very fine dining. And it happens all over the world. Therefore, I mean, the biggest problem you do have over there, I mean, when you're reaching the point in which the government can determine the success or the failure of your business, is really the culture and the moral fiber of the entrepreneurial class. Because you need people that, of course, they will go to dinner with ministers. Who wouldn't? They will shake hands with Sarkozy, also to meet with Carla Bruni, which is a great privilege in life. And so on and so forth. But at a certain point, they will say, no, we are not going down that route. If you look at the history of industrial policies in European countries, once again, you see a staggering amount of stupid decisions. And there were stupid decisions just because the bureaucrats in his ministerial office in Rome or Paris or whatever doesn't have a clue about the market for sunglasses worldwide and the concrete condition for the production of sunglasses in the northeast of Italy. So it's not so much that industrial policy is evil. Of course, the political class wants to have more power because, I mean, they are power maximizer. That's what they do. And they are greedy, like entrepreneurs, but they're not greedy in the sense they want to satisfy the need of people. They're greedy of having more and more power because it translates in benefits. It translates in money for them. But the biggest problem we do have is that centralized decision-making is bound to be stupid. At some point in history, avoiding statism is really avoiding for stupidity to become the principle, the core pillar of the system.
There's a famous Brazilian song that says, a lição sabemos de cor, só nos resta aprender. The lesson we know by heart, but have yet to learn it. Why is it that despite the fact that opinion leaders know that protectionism is bad, that industrial policy is bad, bureaucracy is bad, why is it we know that? We are here, we know, the opinion leaders know. Why is it that these good policies do not get implemented?
Wow, that's the million-dollar question. There are a number of reasons that usually in each part of the world, and in this particular part of the world, it's particularly relevant, have to do with tradition and history. I did a little study once on populism, at least the Latin American version of populism, and I was asking myself the question, where was populism born, at least this kind of populism? And it was very interesting to see that in many ways it was born in Russia and in the United States. Populism, there was an intellectual group of people, some people call them an intellectual class, in the mid-19th century, and even a little earlier in Russia, of people who wanted to achieve socialism without going through capitalism. In other words, they didn't want this long-term process that Marx had viewed, but they actually wanted to go straight to socialism. These were the Narodniks, this intellectual group of people in Russia. Some people, Carlos Sabino, who's a great student of populism in Latin America, and I'm sure he has spoken here, and if he hasn't, you really need to invite him to speak here. He traced populism back to the Narodniks. But it was also present in the United States in the 19th century. It had to do with certain agrarian communities that were very suspicious of the financial sector, and particularly of the East Coast. These were people in the Midwest and other parts of the country. And eventually, the Democrats, the Democratic Party, kind of stole this banner from these groups. So these groups kind of dissolved, and the Democrats became the champions of many forms of populism in the United States. And there is a case to be made that the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States was very much influenced by populism. So we didn't invent populism, but we, I think, gave populism a new flavor in the 20th century. There's a big debate as to when that happened. Was it Perón in the 40s? Was it Vargas here a little earlier? Was it the Mexican Revolution even earlier than that? That's a fascinating intellectual discussion. But whatever the case is, there's no question that there is a long tradition behind populism. And I think we should never underestimate the power of tradition in politics and in Latin American politics. Another reason probably has to do with the fact that we have been endowed by nature with an immense amount of natural resources. And this has been one of the curses of our history. Every time I go to Venezuela, one of the first things I say is, I wish Venezuela did not have all this oil under its surface, because it's been really a curse for that country. And although, of course, under the right type of system, enjoying these natural resources can be a boon, it has been the case in Latin America that because we enjoyed this type of rent during colonial times and during 200 years of Republican history in most Latin American countries, then the need for a system that promoted real production and real productivity was probably postponed. So I think that's another aspect that probably needs to be taken into account. And I could spend a lot of time giving you another, other types of reasons, but some of these reasons I think are important. And one last thing I would say is the great lesson, perhaps not only from Latin America, but also from Europe, is that each generation needs to learn liberty all over again. There's no such thing as learning liberty once and for all, achieving a moderately or semi-free society and being semi-free forever. There's no such thing. The great lesson in Europe is that each generation needs to teach the next generation the lessons of liberty, and that liberty needs to be renewed in every single generation. When I look at Spain, what I see is a very productive society a few decades ago, but at some point that teaching was interrupted. And the last two generations in Spain completely forgot what the causes of the relative prosperity had been, and therefore that lesson was lost in the memory of new generations. So I would say the same about Latin America, because you were asking me, why do we, if we know this lesson by heart, why do we still have to learn it? Because each generation needs to learn it over and over and over again. So the IEE has a lot of work to do in the next century.
Infelizmente, nosso tempo se encerrou. Gostaria de agradecer ao Álvaro e ao Alberto por esse painel e continuamos em seguida. Muito obrigado.